Mr. Pritam Singh.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on both motions, the first filed by PSP NCMP Mr. Leong Man Wai on the 31st of August last month, and the second filed by the Minister of Finance, Mr. Lawrence Wong, on the 8th of September. At their core, both motions concern the employability of the Singapore worker and PMETs. So our local population acutely feels the consequences of Singapore being an open economy, with a large number of foreigners working amongst us and living next to us. On this lived reality, fundamental questions that have come up in the last 2 decades include: where does the Singapore worker stand, and what are his or her job prospects in our hub economy? These questions will continue to come up more regularly than ever as we move into a post-COVID future. My colleagues, MPs Herting Roo, Leon Pereira, Gerald Giam, and James Lim, will also participate in this debate with perspectives on both motions and suggestions on the way forward. My speech is in 3 parts. First, I will set out the Workers' Party's stand on FTAs and the India-Singapore Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or CECA. This part will be brief. Second, I will iterate the public's sentiments on job insecurity felt by Singaporeans. Third, I will make a few suggestions on what should be done to alleviate the concerns of Singaporeans and ensure that the local-foreigner employment divide does not become a permanent fault line. So let me first start by stating the Workers' Party's position on FTAs and CECA. First, we accept that FTAs have encouraged investments and created jobs and opportunities for both Singaporeans as well as foreigners. This is undeniable. Second, we note the government's explanation that CECA does not allow Indian nationals free rein to enter Singapore, and that the entry of foreigners who seek employment is regulated by the government, and specifically the Ministry of Manpower's work pass policies. However, we believe that it is fair to ask whether the government and the MOM for many years past has failed to regulate work passes in the best way possible. I note that the Minister of Manpower recently announced that anti-discrimination legislation will be introduced. This is one of the things that the Workers' Party has called for in its manifesto. Third, the Workers' Party does not assume that good jobs are automatically created for Singaporeans by virtue of Singapore's pro-trade policies and a strong network of FTAs, including CECA. We believe that for a few groups, such as the sandwiched class, workers who lack skills, and lower-income Singaporeans, the opposite may well occur. These groups may see depressed wages and fewer good job opportunities. Our view is that the government needs to intervene aggressively through policy or legislation to ameliorate this and ensure that the availability of stronger safety nets for Singaporeans who cannot make the transition. The government must ensure that Singaporeans are not discriminated against during their job search or at the workplace, and that our education and training systems provide skills that are workplace ready, and that skills are transferred to Singaporeans by foreign talent. Finally, the government should proactively report on the costs and benefits of our FTAs across time, a subject MP James Lim will touch on as well. The Workers' Party also notes that there have been some elements in our society, or perhaps from abroad, that have used CECA as a dog whistle, masquerading racism for genuine economic concerns. The Workers' Party accepts that genuine economic concerns exist and that it is fair to raise concerns about them. However, we abhor and denounce the racism and xenophobia that has become a part of the public narrative in some quarters. Some have gotten away resorting to loose and vile language online as an outlet for their frustration, something they wouldn't do in person, or worse, extended this behavior to the real world. This can never be right and must also be rejected and condemned. I now move on to the second part of my speech, public perceptions on job insecurity. Mr. Speaker, the government would accept that there have been long-simmering emotions amongst a sizable number of Singaporeans surrounding CECA, and more generally over the perception that Singaporeans are denied fair opportunities in the job market. Some of this has resulted in highly charged conversations and incidents, both online and offline, even without the PSP's focus on this subject. Immigration and the job prospects of locals are not only issues for Singaporeans. Globalization has meant that the local populations of many countries, particularly advanced economies, share such concerns. As a young nation, these feelings of insecurity and dislocation can shake our national cohesion, with the country being unrecognizable to the one many of us grew up in. Job displacement is very emotionally jarring, especially when your HR department tells you that your role has been made redundant, only for you to later find out that your job has been rejigged and filled by a foreigner. It is also upsetting for Singaporeans when they learn that a foreigner has filled a job position for which a Singaporean is suitably qualified. The emotions that we see today, while directed differently towards Indians in some cases, have been directed at other communities in the past. As noted by Minister of Manpower in his ministerial statement in July, and I quote, "In the 2000s, we experienced a similar situation when the share of PRCs in our foreign workforce increased significantly before tapering as China's growth took off. Both then and now, the large numbers did not go unnoticed and created friction within our communities," unquote. An important distinction between the vitriol directed against the PRC workers was that many of them were employed in low middle income sectors, while there has been an acute focus on Indian professional workers today. Today, the influx of employees of Indian ethnicity, not all of whom are from India, some are from the US and elsewhere, taking up competitively paying jobs has also activated emotions in not a small number of Singaporeans. Some ask, why can't our people do those jobs? After all, our students score so well on standardized tests. Our much vaunted education system should have put our workforce in a much better position. This is a subject MP Gerald Giam will speak on more about in his speech. Our sense of home is also affected when some EP and S-Pass holders struggle to speak, let alone communicate in our workplace lingua franca, English, which represents a fundamental basis around which we organize public affairs in Singapore. When this happens, some Singaporeans stop feeling that we are one Singapore, all rowing in the same direction. Those Singaporeans who ride on the opportunities created by a growing economy, or who are new immigrants doing well economically, can more readily accept the new status quo. It is a small price to pay, and one can interpret the new reality as the price of progress and economic growth. But for those who lose their jobs, see their incomes stagnate, and fear for their children's prospects in a competitive Singapore, and these are commonly the sandwich class and low-income Singaporeans, strong feelings are aroused, with many feeling that the playing field is uneven and the government is slow to protect Singaporeans in their own land. Ordinary Singaporeans do not delve into the intricacies of free trade agreements. Instead, they look around and come to conclusions based on what they perceive and experience. If Singaporeans have not for years been seeing foreigners occupying well-paying jobs, while qualified Singaporeans are unemployed or underemployed, we would not be talking about this today. Over the last 2 decades, the effect of the government's immigration and foreign talent policies has been so pervasive that former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong covered the subject in his autobiography released only a few months ago, the second part of his autobiography. And I quote, "Take PRs, for example. In the years before the numbers rose to 50,000 and then 70,000 a year. It was nearly 80,000 in 2008. I was surprised and annoyed. I told the Prime Minister so. Since then, we have kept the numbers to around 30,000 PRs every year. But even then, when you add the numbers up over the years, you will begin to feel the cumulative effects within the society and in daily living." Then he goes on, "As a government, we needed to monitor the inflows of PRs and foreign workers, as well as demographic changes, more closely. No surprise that the people reacted in the way they did. The negative ground sentiment went beyond crowdedness. It also encompassed perceived job competitions from foreigners and preference of some companies for foreigners over Singaporeans," unquote. So if a former Prime Minister whose job was not directly threatened or taken away by a foreigner can say he was surprised and annoyed, How much more so for a Singaporean who has experienced such fear of or actual loss of their livelihood? Mr. Speaker, I now move on to the third part of my speech on what needs to be done to repair the local-foreign divide. I make 5 suggestions which I will elaborate on in turn. 1. Policies and procedures must be introduced to more effectively promote and track skills transfers from foreigners to Singaporeans. 2. Fixed-term employment passes tied to skills transfers should be considered. 3. The problem of underemployment must be tracked and solved. 4. The government should consider setting up a parliamentary standing select committee dedicated to overseeing this issue of jobs and foreign employment. And 5. The government needs to communicate more and much better on jobs and foreign employment than it has been doing up to now. The first suggestion, promoting and tracking the transfer of skills to Singaporeans. My first suggestion is that the government should double down on how it monitors the success of skills transfer initiatives, which are generously funded with taxpayers' money. Do skills transfer initiatives work, and to what extent? I spoke about the capability transfer program during the Committee of Supply debates this year. This government program has been extended to 2024, and in its own words seeks to, I quote, support pervasive innovation throughout the economy and build deep capabilities in our local workforce to support companies, associations, and professional bodies to speed up the transfer of global capabilities into Singapore, unquote. Does it do what it promises? There has to be a reckoning, a balance sheet drawn up, whether the successes and shortcomings of such initiatives to transfer skills to Singaporeans are properly accounted for and assessed across sectors and industries. In response to my queries in Parliament, the government reported that $5 million has been spent on the program over the last, $5 million has been spent over the last 5 years, and this initiative has benefited 970 Singaporeans. Without more, this does appear underwhelming. I note that the CTP, or Capability Transfer Program, is only one arrow in the government's quiver. But this only reiterates the point that a holistic assessment and reporting of the transfer of skills from foreigners to Singaporeans is necessary. I suggest that the extent of skills transfer from foreigners to locals be publicly tracked, monitored, and reported as a KPI or key performance indicator for each sector in the revised industry transformation roadmaps under ITM 2.0. As each industry is tracked, reasons should be given why skills can or cannot be transferred. It should also be clearly stated how these gaps are being plugged. Second suggestion, fixed-term employment passes. To ease the insecurity felt by the Singaporean worker, or PMAT, Mr. Speaker, I restate a proposal raised by my colleague, Mr. MP Leon Pereira, at the Committee of Supply debates in March. He suggested fixed-term employment passes that are tied to the training of or skills transferred to Singaporean workers. Currently, employers expect that employment passes of foreigners to be routinely renewed. A fixed-term employment pass would be one that would only be renewed if the applicant company can prove that under the previous EP, Singaporean workers in the company or in the industry benefited from skills upgrading. This new category of work pass can be piloted in newer disruptive industries such as autonomous vehicles and AI, where there should be no reason why Singaporeans should not be the candidates of choice. I hope MOM can look into such alternative proposals to secure tangible and positive outcomes for the Singapore worker, or PMAT, by tracking skills transfer to our people. Third, underemployment. The government needs to track and solve underemployment. Workers' Party Chair Ms. Sylvia Lim in her Committee of Supply speech in 2016 suggested that underemployment should be measured. MOM said at the time that time-related underemployment is the only internationally accepted statistical definition of underemployment, and since it is recommended by the International Labour Organization, or ILO, Singapore follows that norm. Ms. Lim spoke again on underemployment in her 2019 budget speech, to which the former Minister of Manpower responded that MOM is interested in tracking other forms of underemployment, such as skills-related underemployment, but reiterated that there were no internationally recognized ways of doing so. She said that the government was working closely with the ILO to develop suitable methodologies. We have yet to hear of the result of this work with the ILO. Skill-related underemployment appears to be a reality affecting some of our workers. these workers are not undertaking work for which they were trained. For example, engineers working as private hire drivers. Some reskilling initiatives for these workers may be necessary to better align their foundational capabilities. Yet others may have made the transition out of choice. Better measurement and regularly reporting of such underemployment would also enable Singaporeans to assess the government's efforts in this regard. An accurate understanding of skills-based underemployment would also have the knock-on effect of ensuring that the selection criteria for work pass applicants would be more accurately scoped. The Workers' Party suggests that there is an urgent need to publicly track underemployment among Singaporeans and to publish such findings. My fourth suggestion is that there should be a check and balance of a dedicated platform where the policymakers can be questioned. And this is the suggestion of a permanent parliamentary standing select committee dedicated to the issue of jobs and foreign employment. This high level of accountability would do two things. First, such a committee would closely monitor the government's efforts by tracking unemployment and jobs-related data in addition to calling witnesses to give evidence. Tracking unemployment and underemployment, I beg your pardon. Such a committee could also ensure that Singaporeans are getting a fair shake at the workplace and address concerns on job security and employment prospects of Singaporeans, including where training and skills upgrading opportunities lie. Second, such a committee, by virtue of increased transparency and signature compared to the current status quo, would minimize mischievous attempts at stoking xenophobia and unreasonable expectations of job protection regardless of competence. In other parliamentary standing democracies, such permanent parliamentary standing select committees on fundamental national matters that are appropriately resourced and supported by a strong secretariat are par for the course. It is about time we had such a committee. My fifth suggestion is that the government needs to communicate more and much better than it has been doing till now on foreign employment. And by this I mean giving factual information so that public debate can be better informed. And this calls for a change of culture, a philosophical change. The government should have started doing this years ago. Quite clearly, this feeling of displacement and heightened sensitivity was the order of the day well before Seeker entered the public lexicon in the way it has done over the last few months. As early as August 2015, the government fact-checking website Factually put out an article titled, "Does Seeker allow firms to hire Indian professionals in Singapore without valid work passes or without adhering to fair employment guidelines?" The fact that such an article was needed and put out there suggests that the government was fully aware that Seeker was in danger of becoming a fault line many years ago. In July, when Ministers Ong Ye Kung and Minister Tan See Leng made their ministerial statements, I shared with this House that more than 5 years prior, in 2016, my parliamentary colleague, Workers' Party MP Leon Pereira, asked the then Minister of Manpower a straightforward parliamentary question on the number of intra-corporate transferees through Seeker. Specifically, Mr. Pereira asked how many ICTs from India had been approved under Seeker from its first year to the latest year for which data was available. Then Manpower Minister Mr. Lim Swee Say replied, and I quote, "ICTs from any country, including India, would need to meet the ministry's work pass qualifying criteria to work in Singapore. The only difference is that ICTs from all countries are exempted from the advertising requirement in our jobs bank. The ministry does not disclose data on foreign manpower with breakdown by nationality, including data on ICTs," unquote. The government simply refused to answer a question of national relevance for which data was readily available. Is this acceptable? Can Singaporeans be blamed for assuming that the numbers must have been so huge that the government saw fit not to reveal them? To say that no other government reveals information to the granularity requested ignores the fact that Singapore is sui generis, of its own class. How many other multiracial hub economies, immigrant-needy and in our unique geographical and demographic situation can we name? None. The government's position on revealing ICT information, intra-corporate transfer information, seemed to change with Minister Tan See Leng's speech in Parliament in July. I quote, "We recognize that if misconceptions continue to spread, in spite of all our attempts to address them in so many other ways, even more damage will be done. So I will share some numbers to address the misconceptions and allow for a meaningful engagement of the issue, unquote. Minister Tan revealed that the number of ICTs from India was a low figure of 500 in the year 2020. But I should point out that this was a number after the onset of COVID-19. Quite obviously, there must have been a reduction of Indian nationals entering Singapore in 2020 compared to the previous years. The ICT numbers that Mr. Pereira asked for in 2016 would allow us to make a better assessment of the impact of ICTs under SICA compared to other FTAs. Revealing the numbers would promote a fact-based conversation. The government's initiative to release only the ICT figures for 2020 instead of placating SICA detractors may actually have the opposite effect. It begs the question of what the figures for the earlier years were. To help us base today's debate on facts, may I call on the government to now answer the question asked by Mr. Pereira in 2016. How many ICTs have come from India under SICA from 2005 to 2019? As far as the release of information from the government is concerned, may I add that I read the minister's speech with an implicit caveat, and this is Minister Tan See Leng's speech, with the implicit caveat that the government's release of information on such matters would likely continue to be reactive and when it suits the government rather than proactive and when it suits the people. I would be delighted to stand corrected on this, but if I am right that the government prefers to remain reactive, I would suggest that to the government that this approach can no longer hold water, and nor should it, a point MP Hertingru will make in a speech as well. This desire to interrogate facts communicated by the government will only increase, a point I have shared previously in this House. The government must share detailed facts that matter to the public and not only consolidated facts that broadly support the government's position. For example, since July, the government has been using the digital notice boards located at every ground floor, lift lobby in HDB blocks to launch an aggressive campaign to address the concerns surrounding SICA. This is understandable. One prominent figure in the digital notices is that 97,000 Singaporeans have benefited from SICA. But where should Singaporeans go when they want more details? For example, at what wage levels were these jobs? Which industries benefited? Were these jobs part-time or full-time ones? This also invites the question of correlation and causation. Is it possible that these are net jobs created by firms since 2005 that are in India through SICA? If so, that does not necessarily mean that the advantages afforded by SICA created those jobs. Such information is not provided in the displays. I do not believe such additional information is a bridge too far if the government wants to clear the air. Surely it would not be too difficult to incorporate additional detailed information or have it available by way of a QR code in the digital notice display. As intimated earlier, particularly for an issue as sensitive as this, the default position of the government should be to release more information and explain the situation. So the government remains in the most privileged position to move swiftly to assuage public concerns or misunderstanding. The government needs to reflect on its own omissions and resistance when it comes to providing data and information and how it ought to take some responsibility for the groundswell of misinformation about SICA. Many Singaporeans receive news and information through social media. Much of the racist vitriol and xenophobia directed at Indians over SICA can be found online and from anonymous posts. In 2018, the report of the Select Committee for Deliberate Online Falsehoods identified particular traits within the ecology of social media, such as confirmation bias, the illusory truth effect, and the slow drip of falsehoods. Such realities make it more important to be forthcoming and aggressive in releasing information. Separately, the foreigner-local issue is a fault line that can be exploited by external parties to compromise and destroy Singapore's psychological defenses. Some bad actors, knowing that we rely on foreigners to address our fertility numbers and to ensure an economically vibrant and successful Singapore, and are equally aware of how nation building is more challenging as a result for us, would have their own reasons, no doubt, to see Singapore fail. Pitting one racial community against another is an easy way to do this. It is in our nation's interest that the government anticipate, change tack, and drive an active, not passive conversation informed by facts rather than misinformation on jobs and the employment situation in Singapore. In the face of a US-China Cold War and our majority ethnic Chinese population, I would suggest that it is perfectly within the contemplation of other bad actors to use Singapore's racial balance to play out one act of a modern great game amongst our local population, pitting Indians against Chinese as an overlay to fraud Sino-Indian relations and to build up more anger against Indian workers and India in general. There is some data out there on jobs, which the government releases every now and then. But the government can bring this all together with key principles such as MOM, Skills Future Singapore, Workforce Singapore and MTI in an open and accountable manner. If we can classify issues that disturb Singaporeans who would inevitably have less information than the government, we would be able to focus singularly on the progress being made by the Singaporean PMAT and workers and address gaps that develop. So those were the three parts of my speech: the WP's position on FTAs and SICA, local concerns on job insecurity, and suggestions on what needs to be done. Mr. Speaker, may I conclude by saying that being a country open to foreign investment and looking after the Singaporean worker and PMAT must be complementary objectives. In August last year, I said in this House, foreigners are important to Singapore and they help power our economy. Their presence gives Singapore a vitality that keeps us economically relevant and also provides jobs and opportunities to our fellow Singaporeans. Many Singaporeans count the foreigners in our midst, regardless of race, language, or religion, as our friends. But it is precisely because we need foreigners to power our economy that we need to pay more attention to Singapore workers, some of whom feel excluded from opportunities created in their homeland, unquote. The Minister of Finance, Mr. Lawrence Wong, in reference to the ministerial statement made by Ministers Ong Ye Kung and Minister Tan See Leng, said that the tone of how we debate the issue matters. The minister said that if investors start to feel that Singapore is less hospitable to foreign investment and talent, they will surely look for other options. And there are many compelling options everywhere in the world. And we may all end up worse off. In my estimation, sir, a more open and accountable approach by the government to the dynamic employment situation is likely to alleviate the anxieties of foreign businesses. They may well devote their intellectual capital to being a dedicated part of the solution, providing greater emphasis on in-house skills upgrading for all their workers, including Singaporeans, and becoming more conscious of their need to hire and train more locals. The anxieties and concerns of the Singaporean worker and PMAT are real. Our workers carry the same fears and concerns for their children. These insecurities and uncertainties are not recent, and it is for this reason that the Workers' Party proposes an amendment to the Minister of Finance's motion, which I seek to share with this House. May I hand a copy to you, sir, and if permitted, thereafter to members.
Please do. The clerk will examine your proposed amendment for compliance with the standing orders, but meanwhile, please continue your speech.
We just have to wait for the speaker.
Shall I carry on? If you may proceed, please.
So I'll just wait for maybe 15 seconds or so for the amendments to be distributed. So I beg to move the following amendments. Under Lim C, to delete the words supports at the start of the sentence and to replace it with calls for stronger. Under Lim D, to delete the word and. Under Lim E, to include the word and at the end of the sentence after the semicolon. And finally, to insert a new Lim F, which reads as follows. Calls on the government to proactively release information on jobs and employment prospects of Singaporeans and the costs and benefits of free trade agreements and foreign worker policies, with a view to formulating better policies to ensure Singaporeans secure good jobs in Singapore and are not disadvantaged when seeking employment. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to explain the proposed amendments very briefly. The inclusion of the words calls on stronger in place of supports reinforces the importance of correcting course and adjusting or changing policies going forward to address the anxieties among Singaporeans that Lim A of the Minister's motion acknowledges has taken root in the recent past. The new Lim F captures what we in the Workers' Party believes represent a fundamental change of culture needed with respect to information disclosure. A proactive approach to disclosure would operate to take the sting out of misinformation campaigns that ride on jobs and unemployment insecurity and encourage a fact-based conversation amongst our people. This would in turn buttress efforts among Singaporeans to provide feedback on gaps and solutions that can improve outcomes for the Singaporean worker and PMAT. This Lim is not inconsistent with the government's acknowledgement in July that it is better for data, for example, such as that requested by Mr. Leon Pereira on ICT numbers, and this is my example, to come out early when it concerns issues like racism or xenophobia, and that it is much better to quell these issues earlier. So that marks the end of my speech. My colleague MP Herting Roo will propose an amendment to the motion by Mr. Leong Man Wai in her speech. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's been proposed as an amendment to the motion, as articulated by Leader of the Opposition, at para C to delete the word supports at the start of the sentence and to replace it with calls for stronger. At D to delete the word and. At E to include the word and at the end of the sentence after the semicolon. And to insert a whole new Lim F, which reads, calls on the government to proactively release information on jobs and employment prospects of Singaporeans and the costs and benefits of free trade agreements and foreign worker policies with a view to formulating better policies to ensure Singaporeans secure good jobs in Singapore and are not disadvantaged when seeking employment.